Novelist Jonathan Lethem is the New York Times best-selling author of 11 novels, including The Fortress of Solitude and Motherless Brooklyn, which was the winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award. Edward Norton is an actor with a long list of credits, too many to mention. He is a Golden Globe winner and a 3-time Oscar nominee. Motherless Brooklyn is his second film as a director, his debut feature being the award-winning Keeping the Faith. Please welcome Jonathan Lethem and Edward Norton. So I thought if we could start with the book, Jonathan, and since it's the source material, could you speak a little bit about the genesis of it? What brought you to these ideas? What themes did you want to address?
I grew up in New York City and in Brooklyn, and thank you. And but I'd been living in what was to that point my adult life, my whole 20s in the Bay Area, writing stories and novels at the beginning of my writing life that were set anywhere but New York. I was sort of avoiding the subject of where I was from. And I started to get curious to be in New York City more again. There were people I missed. And so the book was a Valentine. It was a return to Brooklyn. And I was suddenly keyed into the language of the streets. And so all of that language started popping to life for me. And at the same time, I discovered, in this kind of happy, lucky way that the writer can be lucky, the existence of the subject of Tourette syndrome, which I really didn't know about. I think back then, this would have been the early 90s, it just wasn't as widely identified in the culture. So when I discovered it, it was really like a startling thing, and also it raised questions for me, because it suggested so many things about language and about the relation of kind of neurological stuff, inside stuff, that I felt really responsive to. Like, oh, my language brain is kind of like this, even if I'm not like this on the outside. And so I felt this outpouring of interest and sympathy and curiosity, and I almost instantly knew I was going to write about it. And this happened to be concurrent with my reconnection with Brooklyn and the language of the place I'd grown up, and my sense of repossessing that language. So I just fused those two things totally.
I think you also were a big, prior to writing that, you were a big fan of noir fiction and noir film, too, right?
Yeah, right. So, I mean, the third element, so there's Brooklyn and Tourette's, and then Edward's right to point out, I'm not mentioning detective stories. I had written one already. In fact, it was the way I figured out how to write a novel. In some ways, circling back to the detective story for my fifth novel, which was Motherless Brooklyn, was a little bit almost of a comfort zone for me. Because I was writing, in some sense, autobiographically for the first time, by talking about the streets I'd grown up on and the schools I'd gone to. And the language was going to be so out of control, so freewheeling. I looked for something very structured and very familiar and with a pleasant, tensile strength of a detective story. It was like, that's a container that I know works and I know how to operate it. So I'm going to use this thing that's been so reliable for me to play against.
It's funny because things you were saying resonated with me. I started becoming aware of Tourette syndrome probably also in like the early 90s when I was in college, and there was a guy, weirdly the town, when I would take the train back to college, and then there was a little taxi service. There was and there's only 2 drivers, this taxi service, and I would get this one guy a lot of times, and he I don't even know if I've told you this, but he said he would, while talking, yell "if," and which that is not one of Lionel's specific word tics in the book. But I don't know what I had read, but I remember at some point having a conversation with this guy and finally saying, "I'm sorry, do you mind my asking, do you have Tourette syndrome?" And he kind of looked at me. He went, "Yeah, how do you know about that?" And I was like, "Oh, I was just really interested." And literally, I think I was 19, 20 years old. The fact that he was always saying "if," it lodged in my brain because I thought it was so funny. It's such a weird, it's such an existential word. It has so much in it. And you know, I never forgot that. And I remember the apartment I was in the village when someone said to me, oh, you know, Jonathan's got a new, we were talking, you came up, someone said Jonathan's got a new novel coming out about a Tourette detective who solves the murder of his boss. And I was like, you had me at Tourette. What, you know, what? I was like, you know, I was like, stop right there. And I got, we chased the book down, and I got it. We're dating ourselves, but I got a fax. I got it in galleys. I got a Xerox. There was a thing called a Xerox where you put things on, you copy the physical copy of it, and you got it. So I had a Xerox of it with a clip binder on it, and I read it around '98. Like I think we were shooting Fight Club when I read it, and that was '98. What's great is when a character is heightened, whether it's Forrest Gump or Lionel or something like this, what's happening is it's Joseph Campbell's old idea about the best stories work when they're transparent. You know, he said if you can see through the story and see how it's really about you, then it has real potency. And to me, very few of us have Tourette's, but we all have the inner voice, and we all immediately relate to how bad it would be if our inner voice was made outer. And I mean, it's happening right now. Literally, all of us have a second voice going on right now in our heads, parallel processing our reactions to things. And if that inner voice was made vocalized, we'd have so much trouble.
What a world it would be.
It would be a very, very different experience. And that was the main emotional hook to me. It was like, could you even pull that off? And my initial reaction was totally a greedy actor reaction. I was like, I want that gig. I want to figure out how you'd hack that. But for me, the other thing was Robert Moses and New York in the 50s. And how do you tell the story of this, really the darkest chapter of what shaped the New York we came up in. And if you came up in New York, you know that everything around you, the secret history of how it all happened is really that there was this Darth Vader who ran the city from the late 20s to the late 60s, and that a lot of the problems that the city has are a function of his willful imposition of very dark things. This was not in the novel. The novel takes place in the 90s. I think I said in one of the earliest times that I proposed this fairly radical idea, I wanted a world that could start to do what I think noir, we've talked about this a lot, noir at its very best, like the noir when it's a serious thing, not sort of B-movie, dime store novel cliche, is really a very American impulse to say, look, we have an American narrative, especially in the post-war. We've got this Pax Americana narrative. But noir is this impulse to pull the corner back and say, underneath that narrative that we all buy into and take a certain pride in, there's a shadow narrative. And in the shadows, there are things going on, power is being deployed in ways that are antagonistic to the story we always sell about ourselves. And if we don't look at that, we get hurt. And this was a strange thing to propose. I want to say the fact that it's a testament to me to Jonathan's bigness as a creator, as a thinker, that he was like, hey, I think the thing I remember Jonathan saying is, I wrote my book, don't rewrite my book, make a great movie. And even, I think, not that long ago, Jonathan was talking about how I think we both feel that there are adaptations of books that are very stultifying movies because they stick too close to the novel.
Yeah, well, when I encouraged you, it wasn't really as the author of Motherless Brooklyn, but as a film goer with a preference. Yeah. And my preference was for, what Howard Hawks did to Hemingway with To Have and Have Not, which is, keep the boat and make a really good Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall movie. And I thought that's the magic possibility for a novelist, is to have their thing become the occasion for one of these mysterious graduations into another form that's genuinely cinematic. Because I agree with you, there are a lot of diligent book adaptations, well mounted, produced to the nth degree, but they're inert, they're not cinematic because they're trying to hew to the way a novel works. And a novel works in language.
And I think that you do have to take you have to take things that are inward in a story like Motherless Brooklyn. You have to find ways to take the essential core, emotional core, which for me in Motherless Brooklyn is empathy, men who are motherless, cities that are motherless, people and places that have been orphaned, misunderstood, treated poorly, that are, and you have to mine that, hold on to that essential core, and then create something that has a bit of a visual scope to it.
It did feel to me as a reader and a viewer that, in essence, Jonathan had written a book, and you took the architecture of it and moved all the furniture out onto the lawn, and then changed the things that you needed to change, and then it became a whole nother house on the block, but still on the block.
Yeah. I mean, I'll give you an example. There's a riff in the book. Lionel does a long riff about the effect of music on his head, and in the book he talks about Prince, and the way that Prince's music is like candy to his brain, and obviously we once we transposed the story to the 50s, that it wasn't going to be that. Once we were in the 50s, obviously the most Tourettic music ever imagined is Bach, jazz. Like that's Tourette's as music is that era's jazz, and I think we obviously transposed that into an interaction with jazz, but that is very much pulled from what I would call the essential relationship that Jonathan creates between Lionel and music.
We've got a couple of minutes that we'd like to open it up to the audience. I will field the questions for our guests.
Edward, this is a question for you. How difficult as an actor was it for you to learn to speak in that Tourettic way so convincingly?
There are people in my life who will say it wasn't that much of a stretch at all. I think there are people in the East Village who are very familiar with seeing me walk around talking into the air, but the great thing about working in New York as an actor for 30 years is that New York is the kind of place where someone muttering to themselves really doesn't get noticed, and even someone sort of shouting, maybe they just, by then they say, oh, he's working on, so we know him, he's the local actor, he's working on something. But it's a strange thing because I feel an affinity for the compulsive component of it, the wordplay, the compulsion to keep twisting words. As an actor, I've never minded doing things over and over and over again, specifically because I like to just fiddle with the sound of the language and its variability. So I won't say that it wasn't pleasurable. Lionel was very pleasurable to me because he's doing something out loud that my brain does a lot inside, and I think there's a musicality to it, and there's an improvisational opportunity in it that's really funny and fun, and I think the biggest challenge with Lionel is to capture all of what's in him as a character, that to allow for it to be funny sometimes, to allow for it to be something that the people who know him, it's sort of there but not a big deal. And then there's those times like alone in his apartment where it's overtaking him, and it really is pain. It really is. And I think that the biggest challenge is to find room for all those levels and balance them.
We have time for one more question. Edward, what were some of the film noirs that really inspired you and influenced you?
Well, we've talked a lot about the ones we love. Chinatown had a big effect on me because I felt it was truly about a place as much as it's the history of LA. And it's the personal and the political, and that was inspiring. But literally, couple months ago, we had dinner, and you said something that's really stuck with me that I'd never heard, which I think Jonathan was saying that sort of in the Agatha Christie era of mystery writing, the detective was figuring out who was the bad person in a room full of good people, and that after Chandler, the detective is trying to find the one good person in a world full of bad people. And that is, I think that is profoundly true. That is what I love about what I call the later, the true noir era is, and I think that's what Lionel's doing.
But you reminded me also, there's this tendency in noir to present, because they're stories of kind of vernacular life and street life, they can also be temporary collections of eccentric families, people who are thrown together and they function as a kind of in a weird way. There's a hard-boiled element, but there's also a very sentimental element. People treating each other with a kind of immediate gestural affection. And when I made that image of the boys, the Minutemen, I think I was reaching for one of those sort of provisional families. When you don't have one, you find one. You throw a lasso of language out, and you find people who bounce back to you. Again, it's about who's worth protecting. Who do you meet who you can immediately trust and care for and who will have your back.
I like the idea that even within traditions of noir, you can still have a moral, the idea of a character rising out of a non-moral place in which his condition is an excuse or a rationale to not be heroic, and realize that, being involved, caring, is heroic, which is not the tradition of noir per se, but I think there's no reason it can't be.
It's the one you're creating. I'm so sorry that we have run out of time. I could listen to you two all day long. Thank you. Congratulations.
Thanks for coming.